Here's a puzzle that has genuinely stumped evolutionary biologists for decades. One that sounds simple on the surface but gets stranger the longer you sit with it. Same-sex attraction exists in a meaningful percentage of the human population, in every culture researchers have studied, and it appears throughout recorded history. From a purely evolutionary standpoint, that shouldn't be possible. Evolution runs on reproduction. Traits that reduce an individual's likelihood of having biological children should, in theory, get filtered out of a population over enough generations. So why hasn't that happened here? Why does this trait keep showing up, generation after generation, across thousands of years and completely unconnected human societies? This isn't a question with one tidy answer. It's an active area of scientific research, with several serious competing hypotheses, none of which has been fully proven, and most of which are probably capturing part of a bigger, more complicated picture. Let's walk through what the actual evidence shows. First, it helps to establish something important. Twin studies and large genetic studies consistently show that sexual orientation has a real biological and genetic component, though it isn't controlled by any single gene, and it isn't fully determined by genetics alone either. In 2019, a massive genome-wide association study led by geneticist Andrea Ganna, analyzing genetic data from nearly 500,000 people, was published in the journal Science. Ganna's team identified several specific locations in the genome statistically associated with same-sex sexual behavior. But critically, these genetic factors, combined, only accounted for a small percentage of the variation between individuals. This tells you something crucial right at the outset. Sexual orientation emerges from a complex mix of genetic predispositions, prenatal biological factors, and environmental influences working together, not from a single evolutionary switch that's either on or off. So if there's a genetic component at all, even a partial one, the evolutionary puzzle remains. Why would genes that reduce the likelihood of direct reproduction persist in a population instead of gradually disappearing? The first major hypothesis is called kin selection, an idea rooted in foundational evolutionary theory developed by biologist William Hamilton. The core logic works like this. Evolution doesn't just care about whether you personally have children, it cares about whether your genes get passed on, and one way genes get passed on is through your relatives, since close relatives share a significant portion of your genetic material. Hamilton's famous concept, often summarized as the idea that an individual can increase their genetic legacy by helping close relatives survive and reproduce successfully, provides a framework for thinking about traits that don't involve direct reproduction at all. Anthropologist Paul Vasey has spent years testing this idea directly, studying a population in Samoa known as the Fa'afafine, individuals assigned male at birth who take on a distinct social role and are primarily attracted to men. Vasey's research found that Fa'afafin individuals showed significantly elevated levels of what researchers call avuncular tendencies, meaning a stronger tendency to invest time, resources, and caregiving effort into their nieces and nephews compared to heterosexual men in the same communities. If this pattern held true widely throughout human evolutionary history, individuals who didn't have children of their own, but who substantially boosted the survival and success of their nieces and nephews, could still be passing on a meaningful share of their genetic material indirectly through relatives who share those same genes. It's an elegant idea, but it isn't the whole story, and Vasey himself has been careful about that. The kin selection hypothesis fits some of the data reasonably well in specific cultural contexts like Samoa, but researchers studying other populations haven't always found the same strong pattern of elevated caregiving toward nieces and nephews, which suggests kin selection alone probably doesn't fully explain what's happening across all human societies. The second major hypothesis involves something called the fraternal birth order effect, and it comes from research led by psychologist Ray Blanchard. Blanchard's studies, replicated across multiple independent research groups, found a consistent and fairly striking statistical pattern. Men with a greater number of older biological brothers are, on average, more likely to be gay, with each additional older brother measurably increasing the statistical likelihood. Critically, this effect appears specific to biological brothers from the same mother, not simply the number of older siblings raised in the same household, which points toward a biological mechanism operating during pregnancy, rather than something purely social or environmental in upbringing. The leading explanation for this pattern involves a maternal immune response. The hypothesis suggests that a mother's immune system may respond to specific proteins produced by a male fetus, proteins involved in typical male brain development, and that this immune response can become progressively stronger with each successive male pregnancy. Over successive pregnancies, this could subtly alter how certain proteins affect fetal brain development in ways that influence later sexual orientation. This doesn't answer the broader evolutionary question of why the underlying genetic or biological susceptibility to this effect exists at all, but it does help explain one specific, well-documented pattern within the larger picture. The third major hypothesis is called sexually antagonistic selection, and it comes from research led by biologist Andrea Camperio Ciani, who studied family patterns among gay men in Italy. Camperio Ciani's research found that the maternal relatives of gay men, specifically women on the mother's side of the family, tended to have measurably higher numbers of children compared to the maternal relatives of heterosexual men. This led to a hypothesis where genetic factors linked to male same-sex attraction might simultaneously increase fertility in female relatives who carry the same genes, when those genes are expressed differently depending on which sex inherits them. This idea connects to a broader concept in evolutionary biology, sexual antagonism, where a genetic variant benefits one sex reproductively while carrying a cost for the other. If a particular set of genes increases fertility and reproductive success in women, those genes could persist and even spread through a population, even if the same genes reduce reproductive likelihood in some of the men who inherit them, as long as the fertility boost in women outweighs the reproductive cost in men across the population as a whole. Building on this idea, evolutionary geneticist William Rice and his colleagues proposed an additional layer, involving epigenetics, meaning chemical modifications that influence how genes are expressed without changing the underlying DNA sequence itself. Rice's team hypothesized that certain epigenetic markers, normally reset between generations, might occasionally carry over from a mother to a son or from a father to a daughter, influencing prenatal hormone sensitivity and, in some cases, subsequently affecting sexual orientation. This model attempts to explain why a trait like same-sex attraction wouldn't need to be directly encoded by simple heritable DNA sequences passed cleanly from parent to child, because epigenetic mechanisms could reintroduce the underlying biological conditions freshly in each generation, semi-independently of straightforward genetic inheritance. Then there's a broader theoretical framework developed through mathematical modeling by evolutionary biologist Sergey Gavrilets and his collaborators. Gavrilets has argued that same-sex attraction may persist, at least in part, because it's tied to genetic and developmental factors that, in slightly different combinations or intensities, also produce traits that are broadly advantageous, such as particular patterns of social bonding, cooperation, or attraction more generally. Under this kind of model, the genes involved aren't specifically for same-sex attraction in an isolated sense. They're part of a broader, more complex developmental system governing attraction and pair bonding as a whole, a system that produces beneficial variation overall, even though one particular expression of it doesn't lead to direct reproduction for every individual who carries it. So where does that leave you, trying to make sense of all this? The honest answer, and the one supported by the actual state of the research, is that there almost certainly isn't a single clean explanation. Multiple mechanisms, kin selection benefiting relatives, immune responses during pregnancy shaping fetal development, sexually antagonistic genetic effects boosting fertility in female relatives, epigenetic inheritance, reintroducing biological conditions across generations, and complex broadly beneficial developmental systems related to social bonding, likely all contribute pieces of the overall picture, in ways that probably vary somewhat across different cultures and populations. What all of these hypotheses share, despite their differences, is a fundamental principle worth sitting with directly. Evolution doesn't evaluate individual traits in complete isolation, asking only whether this specific trait, on its own, maximizes direct personal reproduction. It evaluates entire genetic and developmental systems, weighing costs and benefits that ripple outward through entire families and populations, sometimes across multiple generations, in ways that are far more intricate than a simple single trait in, single outcome out calculation. Same-sex attraction has persisted throughout recorded human history, and very likely for a substantial stretch of time before that. Not because evolution somehow overlooked it, but because the actual mechanics of evolution are more sophisticated than the simplified version most people carry around in their heads. A trait doesn't need to directly maximize an individual's own reproduction in order to persist. It just needs to be woven into a broader biological system that, considered as a whole, continues succeeding across the generations that carry it forward. The more we learn about the past, the better we understand ourselves. If this video sparked your curiosity, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow Phoenix Primeval for more fascinating stories from history, science, and human evolution. Thanks for watching.